Yeah, I think like a lot of the people who are trying to start companies are overachievers and they've always succeeded in life. And I said, in business, you will fail. If you can get your mindset around that you will experience failure, you're going to experience some very dark days, then all of a sudden they become easier to take. I mean, during the pandemic, right? Like we were 17 days away from being out of operating capital. That was a dark month. Our donor, who is very special to me, like, I saw him on an interview one time and, he described himself and his life. He's like, look, there's a jungle there. And you can either be out on the outside of the jungle where it's pretty calm and nice, or you can be in the jungle and you're going to be fighting every day and trying not to get killed. And he's like, for whatever reason, I just like being in the jungle. To me, product market fit means, when people recognize the utility of your products and they want them and they generally can't live without them or don't want to live without them.
That's product market fit.
Product market fit.
Product market fit.
I called it the product market fit question.
Product market fit.
Product market fit.
Product market fit. Product market fit.
I mean, the name of the show is Product Market Fit.
Listen, if you don't want the show to move up the rankings, you don't want it to get better guests, totally get it. You know what? Don't leave a review. Just don't do it. Why would you? But if you want to help out, if you want better and better guests, if you want to help the show move up the rankings, then take literally 5 seconds and hit 5 stars. Thank you. Well, Jim, welcome to the show.
Pablo, thanks for having us.
So, I mean, we were chatting kind of earlier, and you're dropping a bunch of knowledge on heart attacks, which is admittedly not something not something fun in any way, but interesting in the sense that, I really knew nothing about it, and you're kind of an expert in that space. But maybe, we'll talk a lot about that and kind of the problems that are happening in that space. But maybe give us just a bit of background on yourself, because I think it'll help kind of set some context.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I'm a cardiologist by training. I did my postgraduate training at the University of Chicago and moved to New York City in 2005 and spent about 15 years working at New York Presbyterian Hospital and Cornell Medical College on the Upper East Side. There, like what I ended up emphasizing and focusing my time on was non-invasive imaging so that we could understand people's heart disease at scale, and also prevention, trying to sort of do healthcare rather than sick care. So I was sort of the quintessential physician scientist. I, saw patients, and then we ran a bunch of large-scale clinical trials that really informed the thesis of what we're trying to do here at Cleerly.
And, at a high level, what do we know about heart attacks these days? What do they typically happen? What is preventable? What's not preventable? I unfortunately had a friend of mine whose dad just passed away recently from a heart attack, super healthy, ate well, exercise, late 50s, completely inexplicable. Do you see that somewhat commonly, or is that really an odd case? I mean, I don't know anything about this world, so really curious.
Yeah, I'll try to sum up some of the relevant statistics, in efficient way, but heart attacks are the number one cause of death. They're the number one cause of death in men and women. Cardiovascular disease deaths are the number one cause of death, and total 40% more deaths than all cancers combined.
Wow.
So just a massive thing. In the US, there'll be somebody who suffers a heart attack every 40 seconds, which is why we all know somebody like your friend's dad, right? And then the most common presentation for having heart disease like that is not presenting with chest pain or shortness of breath, but it's simply having a catastrophic event, dying of a heart attack or suffering a heart attack at home with no antecedent warning. And that's why it's a silent killer in the majority of people. And the most common diagnosis is suffering a catastrophic event. So we know how to treat somebody once we understand that they have heart disease. We have plenty of good treatments for it. 90% of heart attacks are preventable. It's not that we lack the treatments, it's that we're just not identifying people soon enough so that we can prevent these events from happening. And the last statistic I'll give you is the average age of sudden coronary death, like fatal death due to heart attack, in the US is about 50.
Wow. I thought it was mid-60s that was the average for heart attacks.
I think a lot of the studies that we do are in patients who present with chest pain or shortness of breath, that symptomatic patient. It sounds bad to have chest pain, and it is, but in some ways, those people are sort of the lucky ones because they manage to progress their disease to a point where they actually feel it and become, open to diagnosis. The ones who never feel it, those are the people who go out for a run and never come back, or who go to sleep and never wake up. And That just happens thousands of times every day here in the United States, and we're just not finding those people early enough.
So the average age of those who actually kind of pass away because of a heart attack is around in the 50s.
In the 50s, yes.
Wow. Because we'll dig into obviously what your company does, but what are some of the underlying causes? I mean, maybe the key question is just like, how come we can't identify it, most of the times?
Yeah, it's such a multifactorial disease, right? Like there's things that we consider traditional risk factors like cholesterol and blood pressure and diabetes. And there are things that we consider as what we call risk enhancing factors: kidney disease, lower extremity arterial disease, South Asian descent, HIV positivity, autoimmune diseases like lupus or rheumatoid arthritis. And the list just goes on and on and on. You can list thousands of them. There are probably hundreds of thousands of factors that contribute to heart disease that we just aren't aware of. Mental stress is a big one that I don't think we monitor quite well, but definitely exposes you to higher risks of having heart attacks and so on. So, when something has too many factors that are contributing to the disease, I think that the best way to do it is to find a single metric that integrates the lifetime exposure of that individual to all of those known and unknown risk factors. And that's what we tried to focus on, which was the plaque that is building up silently within the walls of the artery. That is the integrated summation of everything that person experienced over the course of their lifetime.
And is that something you can see, like with imaging?
Historically, we could only see it through invasive tests. So you'd have to stick a wire or a catheter down somebody's heart artery. Obviously, not that many people are going to sign up for that kind of procedure. But in 2005, we saw the advent of a new technology called a coronary CT angiogram, or it's performed on this, what we used to call the 64 slice CT. Now we have like 640 slice CT scanners and so on. And in truth, we didn't understand the vascular biology. We thought that all plaque buildup in the arteries was bad. What we did was we utilized it as a tool in the context of research trials, clinical trials, to better understand what we were seeing and how that affected somebody's outcome. And could we improve the natural history of that outcome by intervening with lifestyle modifications, medical therapies, even stent and bypass surgery? And what we learned was a lot of surprising things. We learned that not all plaque is bad. In fact, that some plaques are extremely dangerous for you and the strongest predictors of who will have a heart attack. And others are actually very stable and almost protected against having a heart attack in the future. And so what we said was, well, if some of the plaques are good and some of the plaques are bad, how do you turn the bad plaques into good plaques? And so we had done a serial study where we had patients that had undergone imaging twice, about 3.5 years apart. And some of them were treated with certain medicines and some of them were not. And what we found was that the medicines, they didn't make plaque go away per se. They just transformed that plaque from the bad to the good plaque over time. And that was the mechanism of stabilization. So you can literally track your plaque and watch whether or not you're getting better or worse over time in a quantitative fashion, and using a single metric that really integrates, again, the summation of all of those contributors to heart disease, most of probably which we don't even understand. So I think that was the thesis. Once we figured that out, we tried to test that out into a clinical program where we thought we could really help people's health. We did that at Cornell. We ran that for many, many years, and we just saw such good outcomes that we said, this has to be available to the world. And that was sort of the thesis of why we started Cleerly. Cleerly wasn't really trying to be an imaging company or an AI company. It was just really trying to standardize the approach to evaluation, education, treatment, and tracking of heart disease. And so, we started that company about 2017, and now we're about 7.5 years in.
What, maybe dive more into that? Like, what was it about what you were doing that couldn't be scaled without Cleerly? Because from the outside looking in, it's like you're doing this imaging, you're doing these studies, you're figuring out what medicines, what kind of procedures or outcomes or whatever drive the positive outcomes. What do you need a company for?
Yeah, it's a great question. So when we were doing that, we had the fortune of being supported by a very generous philanthropic donor. And what we did with some of that donation is that we hired 20 technologists, CT technologists who had gone to radiographic imaging school. And they were the ones who were tracing out all of the images so that we could quantify and characterize the amount and the type of plaque that there was. It was taking them 8-10 hours to do a single patient's image. So it wasn't never going to scale past the Cornell walls. And we didn't actually know when we started it. We had a pretty good hunch that it was going to work based on the clinical trials that we had run, but we didn't really know whether or not it was going to be effective once you applied it and implemented it in daily care. It did, it worked, but we just knew that there was no other hospitals that could afford the luxury of spending 10 hours analyzing a single patient's image. So we had to create automated solutions that could do that at scale. Fortunately, and parallel to some of the clinical trials that we did in 2013, I think we had a computational biology arm, and we shifted all of them to this new concept 12 years ago called machine learning. That turned out to be a good decision. Because as machine learning sort of evolved and we got to that 2017 timeframe when we started the company, that's when deep learning became a thing and was applied to image processing and extracting the kind of data that you need to get from the image in order to provide clinically actionable insights to doctors. And so we said, you know what, we understand sort of this computational approach to how to extract the data. And we understand the clinical approach that we learned from the clinical trials and our prevention program. So we said, well, why don't we put these two things together and really try to develop a standardized care management platform for evaluation, education, treatment, and tracking of heart disease.
Is there anything fundamentally different between looking at this imaging and looking at other images from whether it's MRI, CT scan, or X-rays or whatever? Like, because obviously there's AI being applied. Funny enough, like recently I had an X-ray of my hip, and I obviously got the report, but then I just gave it to like just plain Chat GPT, and I'm like, what is this? And it was seemed pretty good. I mean, TBD how accurate it was. Obviously, I can't actually test how accurate it was, but I was able to understand that it was a hip, and frankly, most of the things that it said were similar to what the report had said. So I was like, okay, that's pretty good. But what makes this kind of so different than that?
Yeah, I mean, so we apply our AI technologies onto typically acquired coronary CT scans of the heart. The CT scans of the heart require contrast, iodinated contrast that allows you to sort of brighten up the inside of the artery so that you can see the walls of the arteries where the plaque builds up. For clarity, it's a very simple test. Like at Cornell, I think we reserve 10 minutes or 15 minutes per appointment. So it's not a long test. It's completely painless, completely non-invasive. And what a CAT scan or a CT scan is essentially just a fancy 3D X-ray. Very safe. Like when we were doing it at Cornell, like I think our average dose was slightly over 1 millisievert of radiation. To put that into context, just walking around New York City or walking around Chicago, Illinois, you'll be exposed to about 3 millisieverts of radiation just from background radon exposure. So very, very low dose, very, very safe test, very, very quick, completely non-invasive. And so we understood that like nobody was going to sign up for invasive procedures where they stick catheters into your heart and things like that. It had to be non-invasive, had to be safe, had to be rapid, but also had to extract all of the information out of it. And to your point, there's many different kinds of imaging. There's CAT scans, there's X-rays, there's MRIs, there's ultrasounds. In this particular case, the only technology that's available today that allows you to look at that really bad plaque, which is the very cholesterol, fatty-filled plaques that are building up silently in the walls of patients' arteries, is the CT scan today.
But I mean, on the analysis side, like, why did it take kind of 8 to 10 hours of manual work to look at that? And what's hard about even today applying AI to it versus applying AI to, my hip X-ray? Or is it the same level of difficulty?
I think it's slightly more difficult. Like the heart, like if you look at this CAT scanners, like the vendors who make them, like the GE, Siemens, Philips, Canons of the world, like they've typically made their holy grail, like scanners that can image the heart accurately. Why is that? It's because it's the most challenging. The heart arteries are very small. And so you have to have something that has very high spatial resolution, like the megapixels on your iPhone camera. And then you also have to have something that has very high temporal resolution, meaning the shutter speed on your camera has to be able to image a moving object and render it motion free. Sort of like when somebody's running across like the field and you try to take a picture with a camera with a slow shutter speed, they just look blurry. And so both of those things had to come into play in order for you to be able to image the heart very accurately, very non-invasively with these CAT scanners. And so I think that the acquisition of the image is very difficult compared to static things like your hip, like it never moves. It's just going to be there, right? And then the size of the plaques are just very small sometimes. And so you really need very accurate AI algorithms in order to effectively do this accurately. There's a number of studies that we've done as a company that have validated our technologies against every invasive catheter that you could think of, to prove that like what we're seeing is actually the disease that the interventional or the invasive tests also see. We've tested against what's called an angiogram, what's called an intravascular ultrasound, an optical coherence tomography catheter, and so on and so on. But we spent a lot of time doing research to get to the point of having a thesis for a company. And now we're spending an enormous amount of effort proving that the technologies are, in fact, best in class.
And then walk me through like the early days of Cleerly. Like I'll admit, most companies I work with, we're talking lean startup, get something out there, get people using it, get traction. Like obviously in the world of health, and especially something like this, it's very different. Like what is, 2017, you decide to do this because you want to kind of have this technology at scale. What is step one?
Yeah, step one is to make a product. So, we spent a couple of years doing product development, got a couple of products through the FDA. The FDA, as you point out, like healthcare is a highly regulated environment, and it's also an environment that is very slow to change, right? So, and the reason it's slow to change is because adoption of new technologies need to be proven to actually help, not harm patients. Otherwise, nobody's going to adopt them. So I think that, for people who are going into healthcare, health tech, let's say, or digital health, these kinds of AI algorithms can be extremely useful. But the first hurdle you're going to get through is like, you got to make a product. The second hurdle that you're going to do is like, you can't sell that product at that time. You've got to get it through the FDA and get it cleared or approved by the FDA. Once you get that product cleared by the FDA, you can sell it, but who's going to buy it and who's going to pay for it? Typically in healthcare, like you use your healthcare insurance, right? So now you have to engage with the payers. There's two sort of major bodies of payers. There's the public payers like Medicare and Medicaid, and then there's the private payers like Aetna, United, Humana, Cigna, Blue Cross Blue Shield. So then you have to do this process where you have to get a code, a CPT code or a current procedural technology code that goes through the American Medical Association. Typically what happens is they issue a transitional code or a temporary code. It's called a Category 3 code. And then you have to prove utilization. And then you can go back and get the permanent code, the Category 1 code. Once you get the code, now you've got to develop a corpus of evidence that shows that it's accurate, but that it also prognosticates outcomes, right? That what you see on the test actually can identify people who are healthy versus sick. And then what you have to do is demonstrate that it actually changes your management. What's the good of a test that doesn't do anything to change management? And once you have that management change, then you have to prove that it actually influences the patient's life in a good way and can improve the patient health outcomes, all the while on a foundation that demonstrates that you should really reduce the costs of the healthcare system, not increase the costs. And so the cost effectiveness or the cost efficiency is something that you have to prove. Once you get all of that corpus of data, now you can go to the payers and say, well, look, I've got a useful test that's accurate, it's prognostic, it changes management, it improves patients' lives, and it saves money. And then but there's 1,100 payers in the country. So then you've got to go talk to them each one by one. And once you do that, hopefully you can get a coverage policy. But a coverage policy doesn't necessarily equate to reimbursement. You can be covered but not reimbursed. Conversely, you can be reimbursed but not covered, but you're trying to get both the coverage and the reimbursement. And so then you go through this effort. And this is probably, I've just described a 10 to 15 year effort here to get to that point. So the product market fit of virality of just building MVP, shipping product, and there's a exponential growth. In healthcare, it's harder to do it than ad tech or something like that.
It's really hard to save lives. Like,
Hard to
that's
save
fine.
lives. Even after you're done with all of
That's
that,
right.
now you got to convince the clinical community that they should be using it, right? So then you've got to get into the guidelines, the professional societal guidelines for recommendations. You've got to have enough data out there with large scale clinical trials to prove, yeah, you know what, this passes the sniff test. You studied 15,000 people for 5 years. This seems like a real test. And so it's just, and then they always say in medicine, that things take about 20 years to change medicine. And if you think about it, that is about the time that it takes for one generation to retire and a new generation to come about. So, once people leave their fellowship, get into a certain practice, they tend to practice that way, right? Because that's the way that it's worked for them in the past. And so the introduction of new technologies to healthcare is there's just a lot of hurdles to get through.
So let's talk in more detail then about kind of each of those, especially the early steps. So like you said, build the product. Like, so what do you define as kind of that V1 product that you set out to build?
Yeah, I mean, in our case, the V1, like we had this grandmaster plan to try to make the world's most comprehensive coronary artery disease solution. I think we've done that. But we probably, like in hindsight, like I don't know if I would have done it the same way. Probably I would have, but we could have built a more minimum product than we did. We just felt like that all of the stuff that was important to doctors and to patients should be included in the platform. And so we spent time to do that. We had an amazing engineering group, and we had amazing product people that like just really thought through the problem. We architected it out from the get-go, and we were extremely diligent in that architecting process. I think that was important, the whole planning process. It's easy when you're excited to just go start to build something, and then you see that you forget a lot of stuff. In hindsight, like, would I have built something a little bit different? I don't know. Like, I mean, we could have built something faster. I don't think it would have been better. And I think that what changes medicine is better, like not better for patients, not faster for patients. So I'm glad that we spent the time to do it. Did a lot of planning, probably 6 months of planning before we even started to write code. And then,
But maybe a stupid question. Like in my head, like what's beyond just the AI that analyzes images and tells you what kind of plaque is there? What else is in that product?
yeah, it's a good question. So, I mean, we have multiple softwares that are embedded into a single user experience. The most important thing that we could have done is to get all of that actionable data out of the images, right? So the amount of disease that you have, the extent, the severity, the type of disease was probably the most important thing. The problem with that is like, if I hand that over to you, it's like me speaking French, right? Or like Japanese to you. It's like a totally different language. It's the language of imaging rather than the language of, common, colloquial speak. And so what I realized when, because we practiced like for so long at New York Presbyterian and Cornell, was that once we had that imaging data, and we would hand it over to clinicians who weren't familiar with imaging, the most important data fell through the cracks because they weren't imagers. And we weren't good at translating it for them. We would talk about all these positive outward remodeling and constrictive nature of this plaque, and this plaque is low density and low attenuation. And everybody's like, I don't know what this means. And it doesn't mean anything to me. And so what we did was we learned over time to write up our reports as physicians in a way that people could understand it. And so what we wanted to do with the platform was also do that translation step automatically. And so what we do is we take the AI, it analyzes the images, it does very comprehensive all-in-one analysis of coronary artery disease, and then it translates it to another platform. And so that platform is really built for all the stakeholders across the care continuum. That means the imager. That also means the general cardiologist, the preventive cardiologist, the interventional cardiologist, the radiologist, the researcher, and the primary care physician, and most importantly, the patient. Like the patient's got to know what's going on. And so we built this platform that really, as long as you can read, you understand exactly what's going on, what the things that we had understood from the clinical trials to be important, and built on infographics, built on completely interactive 360-degree displays of imagings that are
And
on
are
it.
there typically like suggestions on as a patient, here's what you should do to kind of, let's say you're in a bad situation.
We don't do that and the reason we don't do that, we thought about it, we're regulated by the FDA as a clinical decision support tool. So we output the important information. It's up to the doctors to do what they do. That is what decision support is. But more importantly, we would have done that anyway, because we are not here to disintermediate the relationship between the patient and the doctor. We want to enhance that relationship, not get in the middle of it. And so what we do is we provide all of the actionable data, and then the doctors can act upon it as the doctors feel is correct.
And I guess that makes sense. Like, again, if I think about my X-ray that I got, like the report is the report, and then the doctor maybe tells me to go see a physio or like do this or do that. I guess it's similar.
Very similar.
And is the idea that like everybody would get one of these scans like after a certain age every year? Because like what percentage of these cases, heart attacks, are completely asymptomatic before, where people wouldn't think to get any sort of imaging done?
Oh, well over 50%.
Okay. So the idea would be that everybody just does it kind of every year or something like that?
That's our North Star. I mean, like we feel like we understand the vascular biology. We feel that we have an extremely safe, non-invasive tool that has been evaluated with hundreds and hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of patient life years of follow-up. And so, we're doing a large-scale randomized control trial right now. It's about 7,500 patients. We're a little over 2,000 patients enrolled. And the purpose of this trial is to test the hypothesis that image-guided care, clearly guided care, is superior to conventional standard of care in completely asymptomatic people. And so we believe that once you see the image, once you see the disease, you get those people with disease on the right treatment, you will save millions and millions of lives. The reason that we're investing in this trial, which is a long, expensive trial.
Yeah, like how does that, maybe tell me more, like how does that trial work? 7,500 people, all asymptomatic, and you image some and you don't image others, and then you do things about it? Is that like just high level?
And then people act upon the results, doctors do, and then there'll be a follow-up and we'll see which one is better. All of the data that has been published to date would suggest that imaging-guided or imaging-based evaluation and early detection of disease works. I'll give you some examples. Screening mammography, screening colonoscopy, screening pap smears, screening lung CTs, all of those things to combat breast cancer, colon cancer, endometrial cancer, lung cancer, share the commonality that they all use some form of imaging in order to do early detection of disease at a point in time where it's treatable easily, rather than at late disease when people are suffering catastrophic events. And so we believe that the same concept holds true here. Coronary heart disease is a silent disease in the majority. We will never get to them if we, as doctors, just wait in the clinic, because they die at home. And so we need to go upstream and screen the world to find those people before their events occur. In order to do that, we've got to prove it, right? And we've got to prove it within the context of a really well-performed, very generalizable randomized control trial, which is what we're doing.
Seems like, I mean, to me, as somebody who has no idea about any of this world, seems like a no-brainer. But I'm sure it's more complicated than that. Walk me through just on the fundraising side, because that's another thing that, if something's going to take so long, the fundraising becomes ever more important, because there's no way you could just like be profitable. Like you just don't have those choices that other companies might have. What did you raise initially? I assume initially it was a lot about, your background and credibility, and that's what the round was based on. But what did that round look like? And then the next few rounds, like how do you structure the milestones so they get you the next round so you can do the next thing, and so on and so forth?
It's a good question. Like when we did the Series A round, that was led by high net worth individuals and friends and family. And that was really just for product development.
That was your first money in?
That was the first money in.
And how much was that?
It was in the range of, I think there was 8.5 million. Okay. And so we did that when COVID hit, we did a small extension round just to extend the runway for about a year or so, and then emerged with a couple of FDA cleared products. At that point in time, really the emphasis was on the symptomatic patient, because that is what insurance providers allow you to perform imaging on, right? Patients who present with chest pain or shortness of breath. So we raised the Series B round from some traditional sort of early stage medtech venture. And that was, the thesis was like, let's go get those CPT codes. Let's go get those coverage policies. Let's go try to really tackle this addressable market of patients presenting with symptoms suggestive of heart disease. That turns out not to be a small market. It's about somewhere between 15 and 20 million people in the US every year who present like that. And so we did that. And then
at that point, does that mean you're generating revenue from that
we were
part of it?
generating revenue, yeah.
Okay.
But like we didn't
Okay.
have insurance reimbursement, so we had to get revenue the way that we could, and so we started targeting patients in sort of longevity, in in concierge and things like that. And they're very bright, these patients, and they say like, look, if I can get an early look at my heart, I'll do that. And so that's what the doctors were ordering our test on.
And that means they pay out of pocket since you're not covered?
Many of them were paying out of pocket.
Okay.
Yeah. But we really wanted to tackle it so that, I mean, I didn't make a company so that people would have to pay cash. I wanted it to be standard of care and covered by insurance. So we really focused a lot of our efforts from, say, 21 to 24 on market access, meaning the CPT codes and the insurance coverage and reimbursement policies. So that was great. But our North Star, as I told you, was always like, yeah, we believe that it's time, like similar to a mammogram, let's screen. It's a silent killer in people. We'll never see them in the hospitals because they'll die at home. And we really need this screening thing. Otherwise, heart disease will always remain the number one killer because we don't see them as doctors, right? They die before they come to us. And so that's when we had this idea that we would do this large trial and try to prove to the policy regulators that, like, this should be recommended for people because it's good medicine, will save millions of lives, saves hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars over time. And that's when we embarked on the trial. In order to do the trial, though, it's very expensive to do that trial. So we were very fortunate to be introduced to some crossover investors, large mutual fund investors who, they have very large capital to deploy, and they believed and supported the concept that, yes, like this is an innovative tool that leverages AI, leverages 20 years of clinical trial data, leverages a clinical experience that was like extremely successful in reducing heart attacks. And why don't we try to support that so that we can get a policy recommendation for universal screening? And that was our Series C round. So the Series C round came together with Fidelity and T. Rowe Price as
How much was
leading
that?
the round. That was about $225 million.
How much does it cost to get to a big, you mentioned this trial, 7,500 patients. Like what's the cost of that more or less?
Well, we have a lot of in-kind support. Kroger Pharmacy is a partner that distributes the drug. Several pharmaceutical companies have donated in-kind drug. All in, like if you include the in-kind support, like it's well over $200 million to do this trial.
Wow.
It's a very expensive trial.
And the outcome of that, if it's positive, is what exactly?
What we're hopeful for is that it will result in a positive recommendation by the governing bodies to say we should be covered and reimbursed, so that for universal screening of that population of people. Our eligibility criteria for the trial comprises a little over 100 million people in the United States. So it's a very large addressable market, and we just want to get them access to the kinds of care that they deserve.
And then, like you said, so let's say that happens. Now you could theoretically be reimbursed for those 100 million. You've got to go and get all of the kind of healthcare practitioners in there to understand that this exists and, suggest it to like their patients.
Yes. So then there's an educational hurdle that we have to go through. And then there's a practice change that we have, a hurdle that we're going to have to influence. But with 8,000 people and, in 3.5-year follow-up or 4-year follow-up, like if the trial is positive, I'm hopeful it will prove to people that this is the right way to be doing things.
Well, yeah, I sure hope so. Let me stop it there. Like I typically will ask about kind of, maybe I can ask a form of this, but like, because this is the product market fit show, right? So typically I ask like, when did you feel like you had true product market fit?
I can address that actually, Pablo, because the way that we've structured our company is that we've got the one arm that's doing this large trial towards our North Star. That in some ways could be like construed like what a biotech company does, right? A biotech company is a pharmaceutical company that's trying to test a drug. They need to do a large clinical trial to get FDA and to prove to everybody that the drug works. And that's more an R&D kind of thing. And then we've got another side of our company that's really targeting that symptomatic patient population. We believe, and the evidence supports today, that we have the best in class coronary artery disease tool for symptomatic patients who are presenting with chest pain and shortness of breath. So what we want to do is really try to tackle that market from a commercial standpoint. And so, the product market fit that you talk about, I think it's funny. You ask 10 people what does that mean, and you'll get 10 different answers of what product market. To me, product market fit means when people recognize the utility of your products and they want them, and they generally can't live without them or don't want to live without them. And in healthcare, as we talked about, it's like highly regulated, and there's a lot of different components, right? Like CPT codes and coverage policies, reimbursement, so on. But last year was the first year we really started to sell in earnest in that typical medical environment, right? Where it's a fee-for-service environment where, there's an insurance code, you perform a service, somebody gives you a fee, they typically give it to the doctor in the hospital. And that's where we started to make a lot of inroads. And so, you can feel it as a founder or feel it as an employee. Like, the first time you go out, you're pushing a rock up a hill. And then you start to feel like, okay, maybe the rock's a little bit lighter. And then at some point you feel like, hey, we went from a push to a pull, where suddenly some customers are calling you and saying, hey, can you come by? And we're interested in learning more about the product. And, that's just an evolutionary thing. How fast that curve goes from, linear to hockey stick, that's different for every company. But I feel like what we're feeling is that, a warm reception in the marketplace from the clients. We feel like we've got a tool that really helps human beings and patients. And yeah, it's just really literally in the last, I would say, 15 months or so that we felt that, that warmth has been, getting hotter and hotter, which is good.
And can you give me a sense of like scale or traction on that side of the business? Like how many patients have been screened on the symptomatic kind of covered side, or revenue, or whatever you can share?
Yeah, I mean, we've done a blended, compounded annual growth of about a little over 100% over the last 5 years. And so we've been more than doubling every year, which is great. I forget exactly how many patients we've done in total, but it's probably got to be close to 100,000 at this point in time. So somewhere in that range or so. So looking like things are looking bright. I say that carefully because, I think that in healthcare in particular, you should maintain some humility. Like right now, what we want to do is never be wrong. We always want to provide great things for patients. We always want to make sure that our tools help patients. And, that is a constant, iterative, evolutionary process, and one that I think requires you to just stay a little humble and say, like, you know what, like we're going to make better products and we're going to continue to add on to the platform. Our plan over the next year and a half is to introduce a couple more products that I think will be welcomed by the clinical community and the doctors and the patients. So yeah, it's a process, right? Like, I mean, I don't know. I once said to one of our investors, like, look, as long as we get to that point, like, I think we're going to be good. And they said, no, Jim, that's not how it works. And this was 3 years ago. And I said, what do you mean that's not how it works? They're like, oh, it's going to break. Your company's going to break. And then you're going to have to put it back together. And then for a while, things will seem like they're stable. And then it'll break again. And then you're going to have to put it together. But they're like, but companies are always breaking, Jim. Like you can look at the top 10 Fortune 10 companies. They're breaking and somebody's putting them back together again.
That's right.
So yeah, so it's like if one of our donor who is very special to me. Like, I saw him on an interview one time, and, he described himself and his life. He's like, look, there's a jungle there, and you can either be out on the outside of the jungle where it's pretty calm and nice, or you can be in the jungle and you're going to be fighting every day and trying not to get killed. And he's like, for whatever reason, I just like being in the jungle. And I can share that outlook because, sometimes it's frustrating, sometimes it's aggravating, sometimes it's stressful. But I mean, on a daily basis, I can tell you that we have an extremely mission-driven company, and all of us wake up in the morning and go to sleep at night looking in the mirror saying, we are trying to do good for mankind. I mean, and that in and of itself is motivating enough to wake up.
100%. How many people are there now at the company?
We have a little over 200.
And, let me ask you this. Did you think at any point, especially given the nature of Cleerly, like, was there a point where you thought it would break? Like where you thought you're just not going to make it to the next step for whatever reason, it's going to fail?
Oh, there were some dark days, that's for certain. Yeah. And there was more than one dark day,
Tell me
like where
about
you're just
one.
like, I mean, during the pandemic, right? Like we were 17 days away from being out of operating capital. That
Oh,
was a
wow.
dark month, like where, and it's, you think, oh, okay, well, you'll just tell people just be patient for 30 days. No, that's not what happens. Like legally, you cannot do that. You have to put them on furlough or fire them and do a RIF. And if you do a RIF, you can't get them back. And who's going to go on furlough with a startup that is, can't raise money? It just, those were some dark days. And then there are times where, early on, like when we started doing the product, like about 8 months in, we're like, these machine learning algorithms don't work. Like, what's going on? And so, like, that was a very
Oh,
stressful
God.
few months. And then we worked really hard at it. And then about 3.5 months later, suddenly they started working really, really well. And so, there's just like, and it's all different kinds of things, raising money. It's the product. It's the, working with the customers. It's like trying to get through the CPT codes. Like at any given point, I can enumerate for you probably 100 pretty bad days. Like, but you try to bounce back, and that's like part of being in the jungle.
How did you ultimately get through that 17-day period? What did you do?
Some very supportive friends and family, like extremely supportive.
And then, so my last question is, what's like, I'm sure you speak with a lot of founders, like what's some common advice that you find yourself, giving often? Like what's one piece of advice you would give somebody listening?
Yeah, I think like a lot of the people who are trying to start companies are overachievers and they've always succeeded in life. And I said, in business, you will fail. Like, and, there's a tennis player that has a tattoo. I think it's a Samuel Johnson quote. It says, ever tried, ever failed, no worries, fail again, fail better. And if you cannot tolerate failure, like you shouldn't start a company, like, because you're going to fail and you're going to fail over and over and over again. And the goal is to fail better and fail faster. I think that's the biggest thing. If you can get your mindset around that you will experience failure, you're going to experience some very dark days, then all of a sudden they become easier to take, right? Like if you don't expect that and you think that you will never fail, you'll never have a dark day, then those things are sort of more influential bad days to people. So I think embrace the failure. We have a chief commercial officer who always says, embrace the suck, right? Like,
Yes, that's
a lot of it
classic.
sucks. Yeah. A lot of it sucks. So just, but as long as you've got your eye on a North Star and you believe in what you're doing, I mean, the one thing I can say is I am surrounded by 200 people who are mission driven, and that motivates me like you cannot believe. And then every time I hear about somebody like your friend's father, our team is even more motivated to try to get out there, help educate and provide the solutions and tools to get people early diagnosis. So, yeah, I think mission driven is another thing.
Well, Jim, thank you for fighting the good and important fight. And thank you for taking the time to come on the show. It's been great.
Great. Thanks so much for having me, Pablo.
You remember like the first person who told you about Bitcoin, the first person who told you about Uber? You want to be that person because being first is cool. So be a cool person and tell your founder friends. Send it to them on WhatsApp, put it in a WhatsApp group, put it on a Slack channel, let people know about the show, let people know about this episode. Don't let somebody else beat you to the punch and share it with your founder friends first. Remember what Ricky Bobby said. If you ain't first, you're last.